Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TEFAF Coffee Talks. I'm so happy that you're here this morning. This is going to be absolutely fantastic conversation, and one that Priyanka Matthew, who's moderating this panel, and I started talking about last November following the fall fair when she was on a panel on Indian art. So that was exciting. And it just shows you what going out for a glass of wine will do. So just a couple of housekeeping things. Please care for your phones and your panel and your fellow guests by turning them off. Even the best of us forget that. Also, this is a live streamed event. It is live streamed on Facebook and will be up on Facebook for a couple of weeks until the final edit, and then it will be on the website. So if there's something that you missed or you want to recommend this panel to someone else who can't be here this morning, by all means let them know that this and all the panels that have ever been are on the website. Okay? So with that, I'm going to introduce, I'm happy to say, my friend and colleague now, Priyanka Matthew, who's a South Asian specialist with Sunderland Art Agency, which is, I believe, her own. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. I just want to take this moment to thank Linda and TEFAF. This is my second year on a panel, and it's really invigorating and refreshing in the way that TEFAF is encouraging dialogues around art that seem to be outside of the norm. And we had a wonderful panel last fall around South Asian art, and Linda and I became friends, and the story goes, over a glass of wine. I had just come off of seeing an incredible exhibition at the Guggenheim of Hilma Outland, and I was so excited because it just felt like there had been a shift for me in terms of my map of modern art history, and a shift that I was very excited about because, you know, in a sense, there were new strides made in, you know, in the map of history, but it was strides that were driven by a woman. And it got me curious to think about contributions of female artists at the turn of the 20th century, because in my own field in South Asia, there was an incredible female artist called Amrita Shergil, who I will touch upon later. And so it spun this idea to have a geographically inclusive conversation about contributions of great female artists. Before I go on, I have a plethora of riches today, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm absolutely a fangirl on this panel because each and every member of my panel is somebody that I admire and have gotten to know well, and is just fascinating and insightful. And you'll figure out why by the end of the panel. But I'm just going to go into introducing them. To the very left of me is Tracy Bashkoff, who is the Director of Collections and Senior Curator at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, and amongst, and I'm just going to make this short because there are so many, amongst many incredible exhibitions that she's put together over 18, 20 years?
26 years.
26 years of the Guggenheim. The one that stole my heart was Hilma's show, and she was really led that show to be at the Guggenheim. Next to her is David Norman, a friend and colleague, and again, another fangirl moment here, because David was at Sotheby's for very many years, for about 30 years, and led the Impressionist department. He was a worldwide, this I can do without looking at a paper. He was at Sotheby's for 30 years and really initiated some landmark sales in the history of auctions, was pivotal around the first work of art to sell for $1 million. $100 million, sorry. $100 million, which was a Picasso, I believe, right? And then was also pivotal, and this is, I love sitting down and having coffee with David and hearing stories about how he and a small group of friends of his at Sotheby's, colleagues, identified Scream and brought Scream, Edward Monk's famous painting, to the market. So he has much knowledge, and again, is just wonderful to talk to, so I can't wait to hear his contributions. Next to him is another ex-colleague, Carmen Million, and a new friend, and I know that this friendship's going to last a long while. And Carmen was pivotal in the Sotheby's Latin American department for very many years, and now is an independent advisor, and loves to dragon boat. So that's something really special about her. And finally is Craig Yee, my new friend. Craig, I'm going to just read a little bit. Craig is a founding director of Ink Studio, a Beijing-based gallery and experimental art space devoted to documenting and exhibiting Chinese leading contemporary ink artists. In addition to the post-cultural revolution pioneer Chen Halian, Ink Studio has also focused on exhibiting younger generation of female artists. So Craig is really comes with a well of information about art movements in China, and I will say was pivotal in my I remember spending a morning with him at a gallery and really coming into consciousness about Chinese art and sort of the traditions around it. And so I'm really delighted to have all of you. Thank you so much. All right, so let's start. I wanted to start with, I just want to read off, around Hilma Outland, Roberta Smith picked the show to be her critic's pick. And within her article in the New York Times, she wrote, "The year 1907 is imprinted on the minds of many people drawn to modern art as the year it all began, when Picasso opened the path to Cubism with the splintered forms of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Equally startling, 1907 is several years before the triumvirate of European geniuses viewed as the primary innovators of modern abstraction. Wassily Kandinsky, Kazimir Malevich, Piet Mondrian had their breakthroughs primarily during World War I. The idea that a woman got there first, and with such style, is beyond thrilling. Yes, I know art is not a competition. Every artist there is a different place. Abstraction is a pre-existing condition found in all cultures, but still, Alf Klint's there seems so radical, so unlike anything else going on at the time. Her paintings definitively explode the notion of modernist abstraction as a male project. Despite several decades during which modernism's history has been expanded and diversified, there is something towering about the emergence of Alf Klint, which really began in earnest in the 1980s. Her reappearance finally settles the question raised in Linda Nochlund's 1971 essay, "Why have there been no great women artists?" But there have been. But they have been. Their achievements reach us in circuitous ways because of the obstacles that plague artists generally and women particularly. These reasons, so complex and individual, have to do with the nature of artistic ambition, the psychic and material needs that make fulfillment possible, and the extent to which these needs are met by society. So I thought that sort of sets up the idea of exploring, female artistic contributions and the urge to find out more and more of these contributions. And I thought I'd start with Craig. Craig, we've had many conversations, and I know that you when we were talking, I was particularly curious of China's experience in terms of how, were there any women artists at the turn of the 20th century, and how was life like for them?
So thank you, Priyanka, for this opportunity. I'm going to be speaking about an artist named Tseng, and she was born in Beijing in 1925. So mine would be the latest artist, I think, of any of the artists that are being discussed at the panel, partly because the whole notion of modernism, the combination of social, economic, and cultural sort of transformations that happen that we think define modernism doesn't happen in China until after the overthrow of the old dynastic system in 1911, and then a students' movement in 1919 in response to the Versailles Treaty after World War I in 1919 called the May 4th movement. And this created the kind of opportunity for an artist, a woman like Tseng Youhe, to actually receive what would formerly have been considered a man's education. So her mother was a progressive educator of women, so she came from a very progressive family, and her father was a government official who was a revolutionary and met Dr. Sun Yat-sen in Japan when he was a student and was a government official. So through these connections, they were able to introduce their daughter to a series of classical, what we call literati in Beijing, and she received this classical literati education. So what do I mean by literati? Well, the literati arts are calligraphy, poetry, and painting. And this is what a literatist does in terms of creating artwork. Artwork, however, is synonymous basically with moral education. So you may have all heard the value that Chinese culture places on education. Well, the origins of that value actually is in the arts. So the primary modes of education were considered the arts. We could classify them as the humanities. So the route to being fully human, to being a fully complete human being, is through education, but specifically education in the arts. So the fact that Tseng Youhe was given this education, well, had the opportunity to receive this education through some of the finest teachers in Beijing, was really quite extraordinary. So she has an entire career before 1949 as a traditional artist and a traditional calligrapher. She has solo exhibitions in Beijing, in London, in Hong Kong, and in Hawaii during this time. This is absolutely extraordinary. It's unprecedented. Because of the Chinese Revolution, she immigrates to Hawaii, okay? And so she's removed then from this original Confucian classical literary context and is living in Hawaii with her husband, Gustav Eck, who's a famous scholar and a curator at the Honolulu Academy of Arts. And she begins to paint the natural Hawaiian landscape. So she's a landscape artist. She paints the natural Hawaiian landscape. And this ends up releasing her from the whole history of Chinese painting, because now she could paint something that's directly in front of her. One of the fascinating things that happens is because she's now removed from the whole environment of the services or the things that support an artist in Beijing, she has to start doing her own mounting. So she has to mount her own paintings. And this introduces her to her materials, which is paper. So paper is the ground of painting, but in her hands, now that she's mounting her paintings, it becomes her medium. So she begins to collage, she begins to tear her papers, and she begins to move into abstraction. So this engagement with her materials has never been done before in Chinese painting, and this movement into closer to pure abstraction is still figurative, okay, is something that, again, hasn't happened in Chinese painting before. So there's an opportunity in 1957 and 58. She is in Paris for 15 months, and there she's introduced to many of the leading avant-garde artists in Europe, many of whom are deeply fascinated with Chinese painting and calligraphy. And so she begins to see the sympathies between abstraction, gestural abstraction, and the avant-garde art movements, and her own classical training. And what she does is she comes back and she begins with her torn paper technique, okay, and she starts engaging in pure abstraction. I would say that she's one of 3 Chinese artists in the history of Chinese painting at this time who are engaging in pure abstraction at this time. This is the 50s, early 60s. She actually is represented by Edith Halpert at Downtown Gallery, okay? And she is seen as an American artist, actually a Hawaiian American artist, right? Even though she sees herself as a classical Chinese artist. And I think this is also deeply fascinating. In 1972, Edith Halpert dies. Also, her husband passes away the year before in 71. And she, in 1972, receives her PhD from NYU. So in the third stage of her life, she's actually a very, very famous Chinese, or scholar of Chinese art history. She writes some of the most important texts, books on Chinese art history, and she curates some of the most important shows. Her shows having toured at the Metropolitan, the Field Museum, LACMA, just to name a few. Okay? And the last stage of her career is focused on calligraphy and its relationship to abstraction. So again, we now have many artists who are actually doing this. She may be the first artist who's actually taken calligraphy, introduced it into painting, and used calligraphic forms as the basis for abstraction in painting. So at various stages in her careers.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So could you help us understand in what context she is creating and making these strides? What does China look like at that time? We've talked before about, you know, the literati being mostly a sort of a male-dominated space for creating art. Would you give us a little light in terms of sort of the atmosphere in China at that moment?
So the whole tradition of painting in China, and literati painting, as we've talked about, is about 2,000 years old. And during that entire history, women have generally not been admitted to that practice because women were not generally given the education of a literatus. This was considered what men needed to do in order to basically be scholar officials. So the fact that she had access to this education is really quite extraordinary. So on the one hand, she actually represents a woman literatist who's carrying a 2,000-year history of art making into the 20th century.
Right.
And she is, of her entire cohort of artists, male and female, but male artists, she's the only one who actually receives recognition from a New York gallery as an American contemporary artist.
Right.
So
And
it's...
why do you think that is? Broad existential question.
I think part of it, I think the most important thing is her art.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, she's making strides and she's making breakthroughs that people who have received the same education, in my opinion, would never have made.
Right.
She has colleagues and cohorts of male artists, but they don't actually have the same educational background that she has. So she's really quite singular. And even today, amongst the artists that we represent, for instance, they are treading much of the same ground that she tread, but they're actually unaware of her artwork.
Right.
And one of the things that I think is fascinating is if you look at her historically, she is much earlier or amongst the earliest cohort of artists who are working with any of these particular issues.
Interesting.
And yet she is largely forgotten historically. Strangely, at the time, she's incredibly influential. So male artists in Taiwan, for instance, who are treading many of the same paths, look to her for inspiration because she's already succeeded. She's already received international recognition for her art. And she actually helps sponsor their first international exhibitions. So she plays this role, and then all of a sudden, these are the artists, these male artists are the ones that we remember.
Yeah.
And we forget about Tseng He.
Right. Fascinating. So I'm going to jump to Carmen, so we're going to just sort of, I think, thematically do this geographically. And there are great stories to tell from every continent. I have my own. I have been in love with Frida Kahlo for as long as I can remember, but I know that she is just a gateway into a community of artists that were working in Latin America at the time, at the turn of the 20th century. And we've had conversations around them, and I'd love to sort of recreate the conversation we had last night about what was going on in the Americas at that time, the turn of the 20th century, and some of the contributions that they made.
Well, Frida Kahlo is probably one of the best known, one of the most recognized artists in the world. This is Leila Bermeo at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. They have a small exhibition on of Frida's work, which I hope you can go and see. The theme that they have put is Frida Kahlo and popular Mexican folk art. Frida has so many facets. People think of her as folkloric. They think of her as a self-taught painter. Nothing could be further from the truth. She was somebody who was highly educated. She wrote and wrote in English, Spanish, German. She was a ferocious correspondent. She was technically a very well-formed painter. She studied under Morey, so she has a very Renaissance, who advocated a Renaissance type of brushstroke. And you have to see her in the context of her time. The Americas, North and South, were going, at the beginning of the 20th century, were going through a nationalist, shall we say, revival. They were trying to find themes that related to the Americas rather than being Eurocentric. In the North, you have the regionalists, you have Thomas Hart Benton, you have Grant Wood, trying to find the soul of America, Middle America. In Peru, you have the indigenista movement, indigenous. They were trying to find the roots in the Americas for their art. In Peru, in Uruguay, you have the constructivists with Torres Garcia, who were looking at abstraction, but through the roots of Inca sculpture, architecture. And in Mexico, you have all of the intelligentsia trying to find, after the revolution of 1910, trying to find an American language. And they collected pre-Columbian pottery. A lot of the women dressed in regional outfits. It wasn't just Frida running around in those beautiful Tijuana outfits. They tried to ennoble their own history. And so if you have been to her house in Mexico City, you'll see that there's pre-Columbian sculpture, there's a lot of folk art, but she wasn't the only one, is my point. She was part of a much larger movement. And I think she speaks to us today because she looks at our she mirrors sort of our inner angst, and her paintings are a journal. They're a journal of her life, they're a journal of what's happening. She was a Firebrand political artist.
And she was Diego Rivera's wife.
Yes, and despite, she did all of this, like we were saying the other night, like Ginger Rogers, she could dance as well as Fred Astaire, but in high heels and backwards. And, when she was a young kid, she was 18. I mean, she was tiny, she was this big. If you look at her clothes, she had suffered from polio as a child. She had suffered a horrible, basically almost a life-ending tram accident where her pelvis was crushed. She was from her father's second marriage, so she had to fight with the other daughters. And she managed to catch the attention and keep the attention of Diego Rivera, who at the time was perhaps one of the best-known, most famous artists in the world. He went to Chicago. The front page said, "Famous artist arrives with his wife." But she kept painting. She managed the household. She's the one who wrote the lovely letters saying, "Oh, Mr. Firestone, we miss you so much here in Diego. And I hope you've received the portrait, and we have the down payment, and when are we going to receive the second one?" So if you go to her house in Guayacan, in the Casa Azul, you see her little ledgers. She entertained. To me, she was a performance artist, and her art was her life. It was her correspondence. It was the way she received. She was really an extraordinary woman. And I have to say one thing, that in 2000, when I was at Sotheby's, we sold one of her famous self-portraits, and we sold it for over $5 million. And that was the record at auction for any women artist, more than Keefe, Bertha Morisot, all of them. And then there's a picture somewhere at Sotheby's of every Latin woman posed like a soccer team with a champagne glass.
So we were talking yesterday, and Carmen, you were sort of mentioning the atmosphere in the Americas, the idea that it was the atmosphere was where people were seeking sort of nationalist identities. And it wasn't just Frida. It seemed like there was a community of female artists that were developing at that time. Can you give us an idea of sort of what that was? What was the kind of art making happening outside of sort of, for the layperson who doesn't know deep history in Latin America, the community of female painters that you had mentioned?
Well, there were actually, at this period in Mexico City was one of the great hotspots. You had a lot of intellectuals from Europe who were coming to visit. You had a lot of, we think, today everything is done on the phone and everything is immediate and you can fly places. And in those days, you had people who traveled for two weeks on a train. They would go down to Mexico. In New York, you had Miguel Covarrubias, the great caricaturist and Renaissance man, who did all the illustrations for Vanity Fair. And you had this big group of writers and painters, and it was one of the, Mexico City was one of the places to be, and David's probably going to address this a little bit more. You have a second group of women artists who are the women surrealists, the artists in exile from Europe. You have Leonora Carrington, Remedios Varo, you have Alice Raon, you have, besides the local women artists in Mexico, you have the great photographer Lola Alvarez Bravo, who was overshadowed by her husband, Manuel Alvarez Bravo. But I think she was just as good, if not better. And you have Maria Izquierdo, who was the older woman in a young Tamayo's life. And at a certain point, their work is indistinguishable. And it's definitely, in my view, it's the influence of Maria Izquierdo on Tamayo, who became a very famous Mexican painter. She was actually up for one of the great murals, and Siqueiros and Rivera said, oh, she wasn't capable. So she was pushed away. It was hard. You have Rosa Rolanda, who was Covarrubias' wife. It was a tough place to be, but they were all very, very strong women, and they followed their song, as it were.
Wonderful. David, so we have a beautiful painting at TEFAF that we just walked and kind of saw together of Natalia, and you're going to Goncharova, who represents the Russian avant-garde. And there are wonderful stories there too, in terms of sort of movements and contributions that artists, and especially female artists, were. Could you give us a little bit more in terms of what was going on with the movements there? And
yes,
sure.
Absolutely, and that is really magnificent. It's a backdrop to a ballet russe Diaghilev production of Le Coq d'Or. But as I was thinking about this at Priyanka's thank you invitation, it was less individual artists that were coming to mind than the fact that in the first half of the 20th century, there were two movements in which women really rose to prominence and had a leading role. One was Surrealism, and so we're Paris-based. The other is the Russian Avantgarde, and let's say Moscow. And while they both provided this sort of fertile soil for the growth and the ability of female artists to really stand amongst the ranks of the innovators, there were such different movements. I mean, in Surrealism, it was male-dominated still. No woman signed the Surrealist Manifesto by Breton. No women were invited to stand in the group photographs. Dali, Magritte, all of them, the female body was the object of desire. It was lust, it was dissection, it was violence. I mean, they really, of course, they were all plumbing a sort of Freudian depths, and they were innovating less stylistically, but more kind of conceptually in terms of subject matter and the unconscious and dreams. But they certainly weren't necessarily a welcoming, ground for the
Right.
female surrealists. But the women at the time were able to take the premise of all this and bring it to their own ends, which is not the woman as an object of desire, but the woman's desires. And it got deployed in different ways. Leonora Fini, the male figures are very androgynous. She often depicted the women in very more dominant roles, the men in more passive roles. Leonora Carrington, and we'll talk about how they were all drawn to Mexico as well. And there's so much to say about the individuals, but in our dichotomy, then there's the Russian avant-garde. And there had been sort of a late 19th century movement in Russia of sort of liberalism and intellectual circles. Women had more freedom, they gained property rights, much earlier than many other regions, and they were embraced, by their male counterparts between the International Women's Day in 1910, and that sets the ground for the 1917 revolution. Women and men, they're all comrades, which is happening, the Mexican Revolution. They're all working together. It's very non-gender. Surrealism is so, so much of it is gender, men's views of women, women's views of themselves. But, the Russian avant-garde, it is like a program where everyone is equal. The women are leaders of the movement, and the ideals are drawing, like with that Goncharova, both from retaining a sort of folkloric past as they innovate and move toward the very progressive elements of Cubism migrating to become Rayonism and the Russian avant-garde and suprematism. So it's just interesting. Each movement has a very different attitude about the female artist's sort of role and opportunities. Not role, but their opportunities within the movements. They're so different, but it's fascinating to me that each, allowed for some of the great artists to be prominent.
Did the difference in opportunities translate into stylistic differences between the men and women at the time?
Well, in the Russian avant-garde, I wouldn't say stylistic at all. I mean, there was Goncharova who held on a little bit more to the figurative and the primitivist things, combining with fauve or Gauguin-like color harmonies. But it was that movement toward international Cubo-futurist style, that examination we all know so well, that was more sort of thought of as Rayonism.
Right.
And then within, you were asking about stylistic differences. Okay, so they were more uniform in a sense within each artist's individuality. And in Surrealism, it largely was, a more descriptive, illustrative style, more realism, more perspective.
Right.
And it was more the address of the subject matter.
Right.
And another, amazing, fascinating example is an artist like Merritt Oppenheimer, who, made that remarkable piece that was actually the first work by a female artist to be acquired by MoMA, the fur-covered teacup. And, that just conceptually, between taking the object, like in a Duchampian thing, out of its regular context, but then to cover it with fur and all the connotations, the denial of its usefulness, and then all the other elements that come, with that idea of, anyway. If I go too far into that, everyone's going to...
I'm sensitive of time. This is what I meant when I said I have a plethora of riches, and each one of you could give me an hour and I'd still be sitting here and talking. But let's move on to Tracy. Tracy, so the question I have to you is, as somebody who had been at the Guggenheim for the length that you had, what was the decision-making process in terms of trying to, really giving sort of this, at the time, fairly unknown female artist, and a retrospective of the scale that you did give Hilma? And did you anticipate the reaction that you got in terms of how I think Carmen and I had this conversation. I think especially sort of among females, it really sort of created these amazing shifts, and we it was a monumental show. But what went into sort of making that decision, putting it on?
Thank you. As far as our expectations for the show, I mean, we at the Guggenheim felt that it was the right moment to think more expansively about how we tell the story of those early decades of abstraction, of modernism, and that Hilma af Klint's story and her work gave us so many opportunities to kind of plumb that story that we have been for many years at the Guggenheim responsible for telling in a very male way. And so the fit of Hilma af Klint and her story and her association with theosophy and the artists that we have represented over the years and their association with the same kind of thought processes and philosophies really just made it a wonderful fit conceptually for us. I knew Hilma af Klint's work mainly from reproduction. The 1986 catalog that Morey Stockman, the exhibition that he did at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art that was on the topic of the spiritual in abstraction, the catalog from that show has always sat, right over my computer, within arm's reach, because of my work on Kandinsky at the Guggenheim. And it's one of those exhibitions that I feel as if I saw, though I didn't. I very much knew the work, and that was the introduction, really, in 1986 of Hilma af Klint's work into an art world context. As you may have read in the press, she, during her lifetime, did not show the work publicly, except for one exception, and that was not in an art world setting. It was in the setting of a conference on the subject of the spiritual in art in 1928 in London that was held by the anthroposophists. And so, and when she died in 1944, the same year that Kandinsky and Mondrian pass away, coincidentally, she instructs her family not to show the work for 20 years following her death. And as it turns out, it is 40-something years before the work gets shown after she passes away. The family who received the work kind of rolled it up and put it in an attic in Stockholm under a tin roof in the hot summers and the cold winters. And in the 1960s, took that work down and attempted to get the work shown. And there's a story that one of the family members went to see Pontus Hultén, who is the great director at the Moderna Museet in Stockholm at the time, and offered him all of the work. Would you like 1,000 paintings and 100+ notebooks by my aunt, who never showed them once during her lifetime, and so understandably passed on that opportunity. But the word about the work did get out in the 60s, even though the work wasn't really shown at that time. And when Morey Stockman was putting together that 1986 exhibition, he heard of from other historians, art historians, of this work and this family in Stockholm, and went to see it, and then included it in that exhibition. But still, from 1986 until this year is quite a long time for that for the work to not quite get included in exhibitions about those decades at the beginning of abstraction. The work was still sort of sidelined, and it was either sidelined because it was considered not art. For many years, people didn't consider her, like Frida Kahlo, a trained artist, even though she went to the Royal Academy in Stockholm, graduated with honors, was awarded a studio, and was very much part of the art world in Stockholm. But because the work was perhaps done through her spiritualist practice as a medium, that it was kind of shunted aside and for many years not considered art. And so even in that Morey Stockman exhibition, I believe it was Hilton Kramer who wrote about that exhibition and Hilma's work in it, and called it decorative and diagrammatic and not art, not meant to be art. She certainly knew that she was making painting and making art, even though, yeah.
So that's sort of something I wanted to pick up on, because I think one of the common threads when I've sort of spoken to all of you individually is the idea of the artist getting recognition in the moment. It seems to me that, you know, we've sort of had to play catch up in terms of sort of revising our perceptions of contributions of female artists. The artist that I wanted to speak about, and again, I'm going to be really brief, but is from South Asia, is Amrita Shergil. Had a life lived a very short life. 28. She was 28 when she died. Half Hungarian, half Indian, born to a Lahori aristocrat and a Hungarian opera singer, spends most of her life in Paris, her early years, and so is, you know, sort of seeing the work of Braque and Monet and Picasso. And the short history is she comes back to India and starts creating sort of the first paintings of sort of Indian modernism. And I use the word modernism really loosely because it's very hard, we've discussed this, to find a term that envelops artistic development in different parts of the globe. So the idea of modernism here is the idea of a new style of painting, you know, a style of art creation that, around these sort of socio-political moments that are happening geographically. In China, it's the Cultural Revolution. In India, it's independence. In Latin America, the idea of, you know, nationalism, the world wars in Europe, and it all, you know, it's these shifting art movements. So she was one of the first painters before independence. So it's after independence that we have a history of sort of the Indian modernist movement, but this is 20 years before that movement even develops that she starts painting the first sort of stylistically modern paintings in India, and lived a bohemian life, died of an abortion, was a lesbian, and, you know, just a really colorful person. This is a beautiful painting. She painted about 193 paintings, and most of which are in the Modern Art Museum in India. But in a sense, so the work is called Brahmacharis. There are a couple of major works. I wanted to show the Bride's Toilet, but I think my assistant got the wrong image. There are many times where it's almost like the women came first. Honestly, with Hilda, now looking back, she sort of made these discoveries, and then, you know, the movements followed. And I wanted to throw it out to the panel, because this is probably just one question I get to ask, about that sort of dichotomy between sort of agency, you know, women as the agents, women as the agents of change, and why that's at the moment was probably not recognized, but now it's being recognized. And what was it about the atmosphere at that time that didn't sort of allow the recognition in the moment? So, Craig.
I'll just add this basic idea why we should be paying attention to women artists if we haven't been. In China's case, I think because women have been excluded from education and excluded from art making, it's kind of, from our perspective today, just, you know, I can understand the historic perspective, but from our perspective, we're missing half of humanity in the stories that we tell, in the insights that we gain from art. The potential of art is more than halved, I think, when you don't include the perspective of women. And so when opportunities arise in the 20th century, in China's case, so that women could join and can participate, okay, with the kinds of things that we can learn through art, I think don't increase incrementally. It's a complete paradigmatic shift in what we can learn. Okay, so that's the first thing. I think the second thing is because women are actually coming from, in this case, outside the whole history. Okay, there's a way in which women artists don't carry the same burden of history that male artists carry with them. And I think are therefore, from that perspective, able to do things that are far more innovative, radical, creative, okay, at least in the Chinese context, that's what we see. So for instance, post-revolution in China, Mao had the saying, women hold up half the sky. This is maybe similar to the kind of revolution in Russian constructivism, in which women were co-partners with men in the revolution. So this ethos in post-revolution China, women for the first time were allowed into the art academies. But what we've found is by working with these post-liberation women is that they're willing to do things that in the history of Chinese art have never been done before. And I consider, part of the reason why our program focuses on women artists is because this is where we think some of the most revolutionary ideas are coming from the Chinese perspective. So.
Carmen, would you?
Well, when the discussion last night, Greg brought that up. And I think that's very true. And in some way, it's kind of liberating because you're not expected. Right. So you can do whatever you want. Diego Rivera said about Frida, very famously, Frida's the artist I most respect because she copies nobody else. And Frida, at the time, again, married to one of the hot shots of the art world, went everywhere he did. She did have her followers. She did not have her own show until she was dying, basically in her 40s. And she was, that was her first one-person exhibition. And she had a cult following within Mexico, but then she was forgotten. And it wasn't until Hayden Herrera wrote the beautiful biography in 1982, I think, which became a bestseller, that she was sort of rediscovered by a modern generation outside of Mexico. To this day, she is not considered in Mexico. You have Diego, and then you have Frida. Outside of Mexico, you have Frida, and then you have Diego.
Yeah, right. Interesting. I'm going to stop here because I wanted to give about 5 minutes and open it up to the audience. I know we're running out of time. Does anybody?
Can I just say
Sure,
one thing?
sure.
Just the comment, which also persists about Klint being decorative and diagrammatic. You know, and that dismissiveness and that male attitude. I'll go back in terms of context about what made it in the Russian Revolution. So the applied arts, the decorative arts, the folk arts, those were always the women's province. Right. And during the revolution, typical easel painting became very bourgeois, became rejected, and it was, you know, the whole, Gesamtwerk, or the whole application, like in the Bauhaus too, of a style that would permeate into everything in everyday life, into the household wares, architecture. And so an area that had been, you know, considered secondary and more associated with women was now incorporated and on par with the high art. Right. So it wasn't, you know, it was both drawn into the high level, and it wasn't like dismissed because it was feminized or something like that.
Thank you, David. I wanted to open it up to the audience because I did want to hold on to 5 minutes. I'm trying to keep to time. Does anybody have a question for the panel? Yeah.
I think you may have answered it, but I was curious as to why the Russian female artists were included in a way that in the other, in the sort of at the same time frame, women weren't included as equals.
Sure, and I think it's the difference between, sort of, in a way, liberation movements. Like in Surrealism, there was the liberation of sexuality and the psyche and the revealing things, and it was highly individualized. But during the Russian period, there was, you know, a level field, there was an equality, you know, both in revolutionary ideas, economic empowerment, political engagement that was going on during revolutionary moments like that, that really allowed the male artist embrace the women. They were so often artistic couples, but there was equal support and acknowledgement. You know, as best I know, I haven't gone too deep into how the men were reacting, but they were definitely part of the collectivist program, you know, on par, versus in Paris and other areas where it wasn't necessarily the case. And also Surrealism as a movement, you know, was less of it was an idea in the air, something shared, but it was so individualized that, yeah, didn't. I'm sorry?
You're saying it's related to the politics.
Well, I think.
Politics may have driven the equality, not just the stylistic movement.
Yeah, in a revolutionary moment, more access to politics, more work, more everything that kind of integrates the sexes more in economic development, political development, artistic projects. It was, I think, the most, there was the most equality at that moment, I think, in artistic movements.
Anybody else? Well, so I'm just going to, I promised Linda that I'd keep this within an hour, and I'm going to thank you all very much for joining me this morning. And there's a whole host of wonderful programs and talks, and I'd just pass it back to Linda.
If I may add, even though no one asked a question, what I think we have here is a fantastic conversation that's foundational.
Right.
And that this is the moment when we say, and I as a producer of this program, say, what do we do with all this information now? Right. We've sort of laid down, right? We've laid down a path and a direction and a lot of information, and I feel have brought us all along to this. So this may be part one of a ongoing conversation, which I think would be really nice. I mean, I know scheduling is difficult, but it would be great to continue. I've thought of that in terms of, for example, to put a plug in for the Latin American conversation tomorrow morning. In the spring of 2017, we had an original conversation about Latin American art that talked about where it was at that point. Since that time, Latin American art and the way it sees itself in the marketplace has changed actually considerably, which is something we're taking up tomorrow morning. So I think this idea and what I was thinking, listening to all of you, is really now what? We know all this, how do we integrate it, how do we think about it in terms of gender and identity, and how we're looking to the past as we bring it into the moment and for the future. So I hope you'll come back when we have this next panel scheduled, which I think would be a real contribution, actually, to thinking through what it means to recognize these women again, from the distance of time and space. I want to thank you all for coming today. I hope you will share the good news about this panel, encourage people to watch it on Facebook, and come back for another session. And our great thanks to this terrific, spectacular panel of all-stars. Thank you.